Hello there, welcome to the Saroy channel, wherever you are in the world, and so much love to each and every one of you. How are you doing? I do hope you're doing remarkably well. I'm doing great, thank you very much. And I'm so glad to be recording this story for you tonight. So this is part 3 of our story. So if you haven't heard part 1 and part 2, don't forget to click on the description. I do hope you're all incredibly well, and by all means share these stories with anyone who enjoys a very good story. So let's continue with part 3 of our story. The coroner nods. She adjusts her thick-rimmed tortoiseshell glasses on her face. She then directs her attention to all in the courtroom. I do understand that this is a very distressing time for family and friends of Judy Bengali. I ask everyone during these proceedings to conduct yourself in a civilized manner, restraining yourself from any improper conduct. The coroner sends sympathetic glances towards Judy Bengali's family, her dark, kind eyes hovering over Mrs. Bengali for a second longer than most people in the courtroom. Introductions are then made. It would seem different lawyers represent the Hiltons, the Bengalis, the Edwards, and the police. Finally, the retired town sheriff is asked to approach the stand. He walks purposely towards the front of the room, his eyes holding the Bengali family for a brief moment. Bobby had noticed that over 12 years, the sheriff has become even more streamlined and muscular. The years can be seen on the crepey telltale lines around his brown eyes, and the receding grey hair on his head. Bobby thinks the sheriff looks rather distinguished and polished, and it seems that the ravages of age have rather become him. After the sheriff has taken the oath on the Bible, promising to tell the truth and nothing but the truth, so help me God, he's asked to give his formal statement to the court. He discusses the search party that had been orchestrated for Judy Bengali after she fortuitously disappeared 12 years prior. We were first called over to the Bengali residence at about 8 a.m. on Sunday the 8th of April, 1983. The sheriff's gaze travels through the courtroom, settling on the occasional person he is probably acquainted with. Then his eyes skim briefly over Chris Hilton, and there is empathy in that look. He returns his steely gaze directly back to his notes. He shuffles through them rather awkwardly, continuing to address the court, returning to his key notes. Judy Bengali was 18 years old. She had no curfews given her age. The Bengalis were used to her coming home rather late, but at 2 o'clock in the evening, that was too late a time for Judy. Mr. Bengali woke up to find his daughter's bedroom was ajar, and given she always closed her bedroom door at night when she retired to bed, he discreetly checked up on his daughter to see if she had returned home. But her bed had not been slept in. Mr. Bengali knew at once that something was horribly wrong. Judy should have been at home. She was a reliable, very prompt young lady. The family made some urgent phone calls in the middle of the night. Mr. Bengali went to search for Judy himself, visiting the houses of Chris Hilton, Russ Edwards, and Judy's best friend, Alice Corsico. We were to learn that Chris Hilton had allowed Judy to walk home alone after they had a fight together. His brother, Bobby Hilton, was witness to the heated exchange between Judy and his brother. This was the last time anyone saw Judy alive. It was after a great deal of searching. The family then called the sheriff's office to alert us that the 18-year-old, much-loved member of our community was missing. Once the alarms were sounded, search parties were organized, sniffer dogs were used, and the public was alerted to her disappearance. But Judy Bengali never returned home that night, and was subsequently never seen again. As the events of the court rolled on, some discussions became technical and hellishly boring, droning on laboriously like a dripping tap. Questions were answered. The sheriff was cross-examined at one stage by the Bengali lawyer, Mr. Isaac Truman, claiming that the sheriff could have done more to search for the teenager, which was not true in Bobby's opinion. Then it was Chris's turn to come to the stand. The court became stoically silent, as all curious eyes were focused directly on Chris. Although Bobby thought he looked remarkably composed, his hands began twitching nervously, and the bristling Mr. Bengali was glowering at him viciously, almost as if he had just confessed to murdering his daughter. Soon Chris's eloquent voice filled the courtroom, and no one even fiddled with a pencil or coughed in court, as all eyes remained focused on him, possibly watching for any signs in his body language that might betray a guilty conscience. "The last time I saw my girlfriend Judy alive was outside our front door. A friend of mine called Simon had been in the public library earlier on in the day. He told me he had seen Russ Edwards whispering in Judy's ear, and later that day she was seen with him on the swings at the park, near the beach promenade and the Trevally ice cream shop, getting very cosy together. I confronted my girlfriend about this. She assured me nothing was going on between the two of them. She was adamant about this fact. The trouble is, I failed to believe her. She told me Russ was funny, but she would never be interested in him, and she was just nice to people by nature, but it didn't mean that she fancied them. I guess I was jealous and very insecure. I was only 18 at the time. People thought I was very full of myself, but I had my insecurities and self-doubts just like any other person. I'm only human after all. At the time, I genuinely loved Judy Bengali. I believed she was the right girl for me. I could not imagine losing her to another guy. The idea filled me with dread. I knew Russ had had a crush on Judy for a long time. It was well known in town. It seemed that Judy rather enjoyed his attentions, and that annoyed the hell out of me. I was livid with her. I didn't believe her claims that all her flirting with Russ Edwards was completely innocent. Call me paranoid if you like. Maybe I was. I thought she was making a fool out of me. It offended my ego. I'm not proud of myself or the way I behaved. I told her to get lost. She asked me to give her a lift home, or at least to let her phone her father so that he could pick her up. I refused her, I'm ashamed to say. I was so enraged with her. I told her to walk home alone, and that I was adverse to giving hookers lifts. She was very upset with me. I was furious. She told me she was scared to walk home alone, at such a late hour of night, which is understandable, of course. She reminded me that by foot the walk would have taken her 25 minutes. I'm afraid I called her some dreadful names that I'm not proud of, and I don't frankly care to repeat to this courtroom. I did have no sympathy for her plight. Indeed, I was quite pleased that she was stuck between a rock and a hard place, and was forced to walk home all on her own. I did say she could sleep in our greyhound Sophie's kennel, that she sometimes slept in during the summer, the dog I mean. That did not go down well with Judy. My parents were in Seattle at the time, seeing friends, and had taken Sophie along with them. My mother was very fond of that dog at the time. I'm afraid I let Judy walk home alone, which was a dreadful decision that I would live to regret. After a while I came to my senses, realizing that as furious as I was, I could not expect my girlfriend to walk 25 minutes to her home in the dead of night on her own like that. My father had not brought me up to be so unchivalrous. He always told me to treat a woman like a lady, no matter how aggrieved I was with her. I knew if something bad happened to her, that I would never forgive myself. I reluctantly got in my car and drove along the route Judy would have taken, but she was nowhere to be seen. It freaked me out, of course it did. I knew she couldn't have got home in such a short space of time, unless someone had given her a lift. I returned home with a profound sense of prognostication. In hindsight, I should have contacted the Bengali straight away, and shared with them my misgivings. But I drove out again down the same route, looking for her. I persuaded myself that maybe someone she knew had given her a lift home, but my guts were recoiling,
as I think deep down I sensed something was distinctly off. It was at about 2:30 in the morning that Mr. Bengali arrived at our front door, asking me where his daughter was. He was naturally very aggrieved with me. Actually, he was furious for having not lifted his daughter home, and asked me what kind of a man I thought I was. Of course, I have never been able to forgive myself for my insouciance, but I would like to inform the court that I had nothing to do with the disappearance of Judy Bengali. I did not cause her any bodily harm, and if I had done so, I would have confessed to that and served my time in prison. I am not a violent person by nature, but I do have a temper like I did on that night. But I am always in control of my temper. Ostensibly, I could not live with inflicting pain to the Bengali family, for they have the absolute right to know what happened to their daughter.
There were a few mumblings that rambled through the courtroom after Chris's statement. The coroner interjects. She raises up her arm.
"Please, will you be quiet?"
All of a sudden, the retired town sheriff enters the room. He's wearing a grave expression on his flustered face that has turned as red as a field of poppies. He hurriedly steps forward towards the coroner. His powerful demeanour looks quite shaken, like a tree that has been hit by a tornado.
"Your Honour," says the sheriff, "please may I approach the bench?"
The coroner frowns.
"Yes,"
she says, sounding moderately irritated,
"if you must, but this better be good."
The sheriff nods.
"You need to hear this, Your Honour. It will change the trajectory of this case. Something significant has just come up."
Mumbles abound around the courtroom as people whisper among themselves.
"Please be quiet," says the coroner.
Bobby's gaze remains fixed on the coroner. His fingers tremble. His heart flounces around his chest like that of a startled pigeon. What could have happened, he wonders. He knows, as does everybody else in the courtroom, that is holding their breath, that something quite significant has just transpired. After all these years, there is a bewildering sense that answers to an old cold case are on the precipice of being birthed. Mr. Bengali is sitting on the edge of his seat, his back as erect as a pencil, his sharp eyes widening every second, as he focuses steadily on the coroner. Bobby can only imagine what is going through his mind. The lawyers all hurry towards the coroner, and soon they're held up in earnest conversations. There is much head-bobbing. Finally the lawyers all nod in agreement, and then scurry back to their seats. For a moment there is not a whisper or a sound to be heard in the entire courtroom, as everything grows eerily quiet. The coroner addresses the court, her steely eyes focusing on the Bengali family, and then she throws out a bombshell in the courtroom that leaves everyone gasping.
"It has come to my attention that there is new evidence, and in this light the court is now adjourned until further notice," she says, slamming the desk with her wooden baton. When the Hilton family leave the court that day, they barely notice the obtrusive microphones being thrust into their faces as the reporters cry out, "What is this new revelation from the court? Has the body of Judy Bengali been found?" People wave their arms up at the reporters, saying they don't know what's going on, and the retired sheriff speaks to the cameras that are hungry for information. "In the light of new evidence, the court has been adjourned. That is all we're saying at the current moment. There is no further comment to be made." The Hiltons return to their car bemused, and no one says a word on their journey back home. But all are thinking the same. What new evidence has come to light? 2 months later. Bobby sat there waiting in the visitors' room at the prison to meet the prison inmate Terence Oliver, who had informed the police where the body of Judy Bengali could be found. And when her bones were recovered, everyone was at long last able to breathe a huge sigh of relief, for finally both Chris Hilton and Russ Edwards, who had lived under a dark cloud of suspicion for far too long, were now in the clear, and even the Bengalis had reached out to the Hiltons to apologize for doubting their son. "I'm so sorry," Mrs. Bengali had said to Chris when she'd phoned him up in person, her heart heavy with regret. She sounded like she was crying down the telephone, I should never have doubted you, Chris. I was so quick to lay the blame at your door. I'm so dreadfully sorry. I feel so ashamed. I was such a fool. My daughter Judy thought the world of you. She'd tell me she was sure you were the one for her, and that you had a heart of gold. I thought she'd got you so terribly wrong, and that you were some kind of insidious psychopath. But I now know I was so dreadfully wrong. The sheriff has been telling us for years that you had nothing to do with the crime. He kept saying to me, Mrs. Bengali, that young man would not harm a fly, even though he does have a temper on him. But I wouldn't listen. I guess I was looking for someone to blame.
Mrs. Bengali, that's perfectly understandable. Don't apologize to me, said Chris obsequiously. I am the one that should be apologizing to you. I still hold myself accountable for letting your daughter walk home alone that night. I will never be able to forgive myself for that. You're right, it was inopportune timing. If the circumstances had been different, Judy might have arrived home safely. But I was negligent in not taking better care of your daughter. I did go after her, but I was too late. I will always regret that.
We've all done things we regret, Chris. I'm just so upset that the monster Warwick was killed in prison by other inmates there. Why did they have to bloody kill him? He'll never be held accountable for what he's done to my daughter. I wish I could go and see him and give him a piece of my mind for daring to hurt Judy in the way he did. The man was a monster.
Mrs. Bengali, do you know, I agree with you wholeheartedly, but I don't think that man got away with what he did. I'm sure at the end of the day, there is some kind of divine justice that will be served to him.
Oh, I hope you're right, Chris. I really do. I don't want you to ever blame yourself for what happened. Teenagers always have disputes. I did when I had boyfriends, when I was a young lady. It was all just bad luck, a question of my daughter being in the wrong place at the wrong time. I cannot believe she accepted a lift from that thug. What was she thinking? I've always taught my children not to accept lifts from strangers, and then my daughter goes against all my sagacious advice.
It was a very dark night, Mrs. Bengali, Chris reminded her. It would have been very intimidating to walk home at night like that. Maybe Judy thought she could trust Warwick Kavenik. I mean, if you think about criminal monsters, they probably get away with what they've done because they're benign. It is possibly because they don't impose a threat that people tend to trust them. It's like a fly getting tangled up in a spider web. You never expect anything insidious is about to happen until it's too late.
You're probably right, Chris. I just hope Judy didn't suffer. That's one thing that has always troubled me. Anyway, I'm so glad it's finally over, and we have some closure at long last. It was so dreadful not knowing what happened to poor Judy. I now feel I can move forward with my life, and I hope you can do the same, Chris. You're a young man with your whole life ahead of you. I understand you're getting married to a lovely lady from Greece who's just had a baby boy. So congratulations are in order. I wish you both all the happiness in the entire world. You need to move forward, Chris. We all do. We cannot allow that monster to take anything more from our lives than he already has.
You're right, Mrs. Bengali. We need to put this behind us, but we will never ever forget Judy and what she meant to us all. She was a very special person.
That she was, Chris, said Mrs. Bengali wistfully.
Bobby did not know why he'd come to the prison to see Terence Oliver, whom had surprisingly agreed to see Bobby. He knew in his gut that he had requested this visit for his own peace of mind, and for closure to the Judy Bengali case that had haunted the remainder of his teenage years. No one in his immediate family knew he was meeting up with Terence Oliver. This was the man who was the one that informed the press where the body of Judy Bengali could be found. True to his word,
After a map had been drawn up, Judy's body was located under a very distinctive tree with a split trunk and another tree growing through the split. The tree looked like two conjoined hunchback old men. Bobby had not come to the prison for anybody else except himself. He was still so haunted by this horrifying case. He was certain there was so much more to the story than met the eye. He wanted to know everything that had happened to Judy on that lonely, cool Saturday night in April 12 years prior, and was seeking some kind of personal closure. He knew he needed to meet the prisoner who'd shared a cell with Warwick to glean some insight into the case. Now he was having some vacillating reservations about whether meeting up with this man was a good idea after all. He had no idea what Terence Oliver was incarcerated for, but maybe the less he knew about it, the better. The main thing was the man had agreed to see him, which was a promising start. Bobby glanced around the square visitors' room rather nervously. It was incredibly grim. 2 armed policemen stood on either side of the room, their eyes almost like stone marbles as they stared towards the mid-centre, with fearsome expressions on their faces. Both men were burly, rather reminding Bobby of Rottweilers on guard duty, that would pounce at once if anything went awry. There was a clock on the further side wall, counting the minutes. The poky tables and hard, uncongenial visitors' chairs were hardly friendly, but maybe that was the whole idea. Nothing about prison was supposed to be cosy. There were some visitors speaking to prisoners, but still there appeared to be no sign of Terence Oliver. Where was he? Had he changed his mind about speaking to Bobby? Then there he was, a flash of orange being brought over to his table by a police guard, his legs shackled. "You're Bobby Hilton?" he asked. Bobby nodded, and the prisoner sat down opposite him. Bobby stared at him curiously. He looked relatively non-threatening, a slender man in his 50s with grey hair and brown ferret-like eyes that stared at Bobby inquisitively. He looked like a regular man you might see when walking your dog in the park. "Thank you for agreeing to see me about this case. I do appreciate it very much." "I only agreed to see you because you're the brother of Chris Hilton, the man who was under suspicion for the disappearance of Judy Bengali. He has my sympathy. I do hate it when people get falsely charged for something they did not do." "Why did you speak out about this case?" asked Bobby gingerly. "It was when I heard about the inquest," said Terence sorrowfully. "I thought about that poor mother, having no closure for years and years, in being able to bury her daughter. I imagined what she'd been through all this time. When I saw her distraught expression in the newspaper, along with the picture of Judy Bengali, I knew I needed to speak out. I have a mother myself. I can't imagine what that would have done to her. Of course, I wouldn't have spoken out if my cellmate was still alive. I'd have an obligation of loyalty to him. There can be a code of ethics in prison that you don't like to breach. Warwick got stabbed over a minor dispute in prison, so now he's gone. So I'm free to discuss the case," he said nonchalantly. "I swore to Warwick I'd never tell anyone his secret. But I guess I'm entitled to talk about it now that he's dead, although the police aren't giving me any plea deals. But I'm okay with that. It is what it is." "So what made Warwick tell you about Judy?" Terence scratched his head reflectively. "Well, you know, we shared a lot together back then. The 2 of us were stuck in a cell together. And when you're with your cellmate 24/7, you get talking about everything, including secrets and regrets, of course. He asked me if I'd ever killed anyone before. I said of course not. I've defrauded people, done bad things in my life. Of course I have, but I would never kill anyone. "What do you take me for?" I told him. "I'm no monster." I could see a troubled look on his face, and I said, "Why? Have you killed anyone?" He looked at me incredulously and pretty much jumped down my throat and said, "What do you take me for? Of course I haven't killed anyone. But if I got a chance to kill half these prison inmates, especially Dirk Potter,
That man is a psychopath. I'd do it in a heartbeat. After our fraught conversation, I did sense something was amiss, and that he had something on his mind, and I knew he was hiding something from me. One day I saw Warwick drawing a picture of a woman with strawberry blonde hair. He was a brilliant artist, you know. I will say that for him. The inmates would bring him photographs of loved ones and ask them to draw pictures of them, in exchange for cigarettes and stuff like that. I thought him to be a halfway decent person, compared to some of the inmates here. Not everyone who's murdered is a monster, you know. And believe it or not, Warwick wasn't all bad. He had his good qualities, but he did have a temper on him that could get out of hand at times. I asked him who the picture of the girl was. I said she had beautiful hair and looked very feminine with her porcelain complexion. I thought it might be a lover of his, a girlfriend perhaps, or even a sister that he was pining after and missing desperately. He told me it was none of my bloody business, so I didn't intrude any further. He got very defensive and very brusque with me. I noticed he would look at the picture a lot and sigh. I figured out that this was a woman he had once loved, and for some reason or another his heart had been grievously broken by this person. I had no way of knowing he was nursing a dark, clandestine secret, and that this was the picture of the woman he'd actually killed. One day he was lying in the bunk under mine. He asked me once again, "Terence, have you ever killed anyone before?" This was the second time he'd asked me exactly the same question. I sat up in bed and said, "I told you, I've never killed anyone. Why do you keep asking me this insane question? I've told you some of my less than pretty secrets. I've got nothing to hide, Warwick. I'm in prison for fraud." He said to me, "Well, I've killed before." I remember lying there thinking, I can't believe he actually said that. He was pulling a fast one, surely he was. Granted, he did get himself embroiled in some cantankerous disputes and altercations in prison. He beat up a guy badly one day. The man was hospitalized for over 3 weeks. But I didn't think he'd have murdered anyone. He was in prison for embezzlement and stuff like that, but not grievous bodily harm. I didn't say anything as I lay back in my bed, soaking in what he'd said to me. I will admit I was shocked. I said only 4 words. "Who did you kill?" He told me, "You know the picture of the girl with the strawberry blonde hair and the blue eyes? I killed her." When he told me that, I was confounded. It's one thing to kill a man after a pub brawl that goes badly awry, but to kill a woman, well, that's very wrong. He told me he hadn't intended to kill her. He said he'd been driving down this lonely road in the middle of the night. He was visiting cousins of his, staying over at their place. He was suffering from insomnia, and when he did, he took himself for a drive. He loved driving at night. It calmed his nerves. Then he saw a young lady walking on her own. Even though her eyes were puffy and she looked distraught, he thought she was very beautiful. He'd always been partial to Titian colouring and fair skin. So he stopped his car and asked the girl if she needed a lift. He said she looked scared to be walking in the dark, and reluctantly agreed to accept his lift. He said she had a good sense of humour. She said, "I'm not supposed to accept lift from strangers. You're not the axe murderer, are you?" He laughed and said, "Do I look like an axe murderer?" She stood back and looked at him and said, "I suppose I can trust you. But if my mum had an inkling I was accepting a lift from a stranger, she'd murder me, quite literally." She climbed into the seat next to him and said it was kind of him to give her a lift. She was in a right state, she sure was. He could see she'd been crying and offered her some tissues so that she could blow her nose. He told her that whatever she was upset about, it couldn't be that bad. It wasn't the end of the world. She was crying and saying she was afraid that her boyfriend was going to dump her because he thought she was cheating with someone else. I don't want to lose him, she said, but I'm pretty sure it's over between us. He made me walk home tonight, all on my own. Can you believe that? Can you believe he would do that? He'd never normally do that to me. He's usually such a gentleman. But tonight he was so angry. I've never seen him like that before. Some guy phoned him up to tell him I was flirting with a guy called Russ. And of course, Chris believed all the lies. Whoever they were, they're such a snitch. I like Russ. He's a nice boy. He makes me laugh, but that's it. But of course, Chris won't believe a word of it. Warwick told her that her boyfriend was a loser, making her walk home all on her own. He told her she deserved so much better. Besides, her boyfriend was still very young and immature. She'd be so much better off with an older man who was more, together. And he said that he could make her feel a lot better. He told her that they could go back to his place and have a nice drink together and talk, nothing more. She said that they could go for a drive and just talk, but she didn't want to go to his house. He told her he knew of a pretty place where they could have a nice chat. Soon he parked his car near Marlow Hollow and sat in the car smoking cigarettes with her. Judy told him all about her boyfriend and how jealous he was.
I think he's insecure, I mean, the girls all fancy him at school because he's a hottie. But underneath the layers, he's actually got not much confidence, He's always threatened about me going off with someone else. I wish he'd trust me more, but he doesn't. It drives me nuts.
Warwick had some vodka in the car. They both took a few swigs. She told him,
"Take me home, please. It's getting late. My parents will start worrying."
He said they were in a very beautiful location, on a quiet road, surrounded by lots and lots of lofty trees. He leant over to kiss her, telling her that she was very beautiful, and she got very upset. She hurriedly opened the car door and got out, telling him,
"Leave me alone! What's wrong with you? I told you I've got a boyfriend. I just wanted to talk, that's all. I thought you understood."
Well, Warwick got very angry. "I don't know why she had been confiding in me," he said. "I thought she liked me. I was obviously getting all the wrong signals." This was what he said to me, in his own words. "I was attracted to her, and I grabbed her, and I was trying to kiss her. She began to run in the woods, so I chased after her. It was very dark in the woods. I almost gave up following her. But through some moonlight trickling through the trees, I saw her ambiguously slipping away. I think I almost became like a predatory lion in pursuit of its kill. I knew I wanted her. It was impossible to stop myself. My desire was insatiable, and her vulnerability made her even more irresistible in my eyes. I've never wanted a woman more, as much as I wanted her. I grabbed her rather fiercely, I have to admit, pinning her down onto the ground beneath me. She was slapping me, wriggling, scratching me, and the next thing I knew I just lost my temper. I had my hands over her neck, and I was squeezing and squeezing. I was so angry with her rejection of me. I was shouting obscenities at her like, "You bitch! Why are you such a tease?" It all happened so quickly. I don't know what came over me. I never knew I was capable of murder. But I killed her so easily with my bare hands. And when I let go of her and realized she was dead, I was confounded. I couldn't believe what I'd done. I was actually very shocked and startled. It had been so easy to kill, scarily so. I then heard this monstrous roar. Something came charging towards me. I've never been so frightened in all my bloody life. I was in the woods, and this black, ponderous, big shape came galloping towards me, snapping twigs, beating the ground so heavily with its powerful legs. Honestly, it sounded like a herd of galloping bison were literally thundering towards me. The ground heaved like the loose floorboards in a house. Would you bloody believe it? It was a Bigfoot. This titanic, furiously enraged thing was snarling at me, nostrils flaring, jaws wide open, revealing its teeth. It was glaring at me with monotonous yellow eyes. You have no idea how huge this thing was. He stood there yards away from me. I thought I was dead. That look in his eyes was, "I want to kill you. I want to kill you." I felt cornered by this thing. It looked at me and then at the limp figure of the girl lying next to me. And would you believe it? I know you're not going to believe this, but he spoke to me. I know it sounds insane, but it's true. The strange language was translated into my head. The words were, "What have you done? What have you done?" "Sakani! Sakani!" something like that. He ran over to the girl and picked her up, slapping her cheeks, trying to rouse her from her deceased state. I just stood there, watching, completely bemused. I was so terrified. I froze to the spot, my legs crumbling beneath me. This Bigfoot was so upset to see this girl dead. He began to beat his chest. He actually howled as if I'd killed his very best friend. He took it personally. I was astonished. I just stood there when he was telling me to get the hell out of there. I mean, this Herculean creature was disgruntled and less than amused. He knew I was responsible for killing this girl. He wanted to do the very same to me. I was sure of that. He looked enraged, his fiery eyes burnt into mine, and he growled like a rabid dog, virtually foaming at the mouth. I thought he was going to kill me. He gave me chase. I ran as fast as I possibly could. My legs felt like cement beneath me. But I managed to get to the car in time. The creature was shaking his fists, shrieking at me, following my car. When I heard all the news about them looking for Judy Bengali, I knew I had to go back to those woods to recover the body. I was absolutely certain that if they found her body, there'd be my DNA under her fingernails. I didn't want her to be discovered, and for me to be accused of the crime, because she had scratched me. I needed to get back to the woods and remove the body, bury it somewhere more discreet, where it'd be less likely to be found. I was worried I'd encounter that monstrous Bigfoot again. I was going to the woods at night so I wouldn't be seen. But this time I went armed with a rifle, so if I encountered that beast, I'd kill him at once. I knew looking for the girl's body during the day would not be a wise thing to do. There were too many people sniffing around at the time. I couldn't afford to take the risk, despite the fact it was a secluded area, further afield from where Judy went missing. But I wasn't prepared to take any chances. You can't be too careful. It was 12 o'clock at night when I arrived in the wooded area. It was a long way away from where the searches were being conducted for Judy. There I was, with a torch and a rifle, slipping stealthily into the woodgrove to recover her body. I had in mind that I was going to toss it into a large lake. I walked into the grove and found her grave. Not her body, her grave. I knew it was her grave, as it hadn't been there the day before. I discovered this huge burial mound covered with sticks and fresh wild flowers, and I knew at once the Bigfoot had buried her there. It was located under a very distinctive tree that I knew I would never forget. I became nervous when I realized I was being watched. I knew at once. It felt as if there were vindictive eyes everywhere, spying on me, spitefully burning into the back of my neck, watching and waiting for me. Every hair on my arm was standing up erect. I've never felt fear like that. I heard whistles, wood knocks, owl hoots being exchanged like some kind of secret code being communicated in the trees. And it was all about my presence in the wood grove. I knew it was. I began to feel that my rifle would be pretty useless as a form of defence. Then there he was again, the Bigfoot, standing there, watching me. And it was worse than I could have imagined, because there were 3 of them, all equally as formidable and intimidating. They stood there in front of me, like a wall of steel. And in that moment, I knew I was dead. The monstrously big male Bigfoot grabbed my rifle, furiously snapping it in half, throwing it into the trees in disgust. His blazing eyes were on fire with indignation. They all shrieked at me, telling me to go away. They were furious that I had had the audacity to come back. They then chased me out of the woods, snorting behind me and screaming. The male Bigfoot grabbed my arm, snapped it in half, just like my rifle. And it was agonizingly painful. My arm was literally hanging off me like a rag doll. But I managed to get away. But that part of my memory is a blur, because it was so traumatic. I think I blotted it out. Those things wanted me dead. I think the female persuaded the big male not to kill me. I knew I'd never go back to that place again. But after seeing the burial mound, I was reasonably satisfied that Judy's body would never be found.
Bobby stared at Terence Oliver, looking stupefied.
"He told you all that?" "I'm afraid so," said Terence. "And you can be as cynical as you like about the story, but I believed every word that Warwick told me. When he started telling me about the Bigfoots, he was shaking like a leaf. He said those things scared the bejesus out of him. He said he'd rather have encountered a rampaging bull elephant than those things. They scared the hell out of him. He was certain they were going to kill him. And when he told me the story, he wept and wept like a baby." "If you don't mind me asking, how were you able to tell the police where they'd find her body?" asked Bobby. "Because Warwick told me the location. He even drew the tree, showing me exactly where it was buried. It looked like a conjoined hunchback, that tree. The police found it easy enough." Bobby walked away from the prison with one thought on his mind. My God, that was some story. It would seem while Terence had left out the details of the Bigfoots to the police, he had felt comfortable enough to share those details with Bobby. At least now he could put the dreadful case of Judy Bengali behind him and begin to live again. And knowing what happened really helped. So there we are. That's my story. Well, what can I say? Oh, nothing like a cold case, is there? I mean, goodness gracious me. And it seems like that man who harmed Judy Bengali, he certainly got his run for his money. He certainly got some divine justice in the end with those Bigfoots going after him. It's amazing that they didn't kill him after what he'd done to Judy. But anyway, what an extraordinary story. Until next time, goodbye and good night.